Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion, Shifting the Gaze, Countering Urban Overlookedness, organized by Publics at IIHS in collaboration with Urbanisation Journal. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lubna Dugal, and I'm Associate Editor at Urbanisation and Senior Consultant at the Word Lab at IIHS. To give you a brief introduction about the platform, Publics at IIHS is where we invite researchers and practitioners to share emerging knowledge on the urban. Urbanization is IIHS's flagship journal published by SAGE. It's a biannual peer-reviewed journal that aims to illuminate the global urban condition with a firm footprint in the global south. The journal, now in its 10th year, has published several special issues on topics like climate change, inequality and COVID-19, gender and work, agrarian urbanism, and migration. We invite submissions on a rolling basis all year round, and you can find the link to the website in the chat for more information. Today's panel discussion includes contributors of the latest special issue, Overlooked People, Places, and Practices, Shifting the Gaze in Asian and South African Cities. This issue is free to access on our website till the end of July, so you can find the link in the chat for that as well. So let us begin this evening's session. We request you to write your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be addressing them at the end of the session. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderators and speakers for today's webinar. We were actually going to have Dr. Chandni Singh as the moderator, but she was unable to join due to health reasons. She had also anchored this special issue from within the Urbanisation editorial team for us. But graciously, we've had Julia and Isolde, who are the guest editors of the issue, stepping in and moderating the session for us today. Julia is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Geography and Regional Research at the University of Vienna, and Isolde is with the Supreme Court of Appeal, South Africa, and extraordinary professor at the Free State Center for Human Rights, University of the Free State in South Africa. The authors who are joining us as speakers today are Rita Padavangi, Associate Professor at the College of Interdisciplinary and Experiential Learning at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. We have Chester Antonio C. Archela, Associate Professor, Development Studies Program at the Department of Social Sciences, University of the Philippines, Manila, and Research Associate at Department of Sociology, University of Pretoria. We have Latifa Joseph Rajab, Master Student at the Department of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics, University of Cape Town. We have Stefan de Beer, Director at the Center for Faith and Community, and Professor of Practical Theology at University of Pretoria. We have Irene Grace Andal, Research Fellow at the Erlangga Institute of Indian Ocean Crossroads from Indonesia. And we have Siddharth Dasgupta, who's a writer and cultural journalist based in Pune, in India. I hand it over to you now, Julia and Isolde, to take this forward.
Thank you so much, Lubna, for the introduction and also for the invitation to the Publics at IIHS. So as everyone has heard, very warm welcome to all the speakers, to all the attendees. We have 7 wonderful speakers today who have written about their perspectives on overlookedness, how to counter the intentional or unintentional omissions, neglect, marginalization of certain people, places, and practices. And what we want to do today is to broadly structure the webinar in 2 parts. So first, to focus on how researchers, how practitioners, how artists shift their gaze to overlooked small, intermediate, secondary cities, and further also to overlooked, neglected lived experiences and practices of urban dwellers. And in the second part, to see what it means and also what it takes to counter this overlooking, to counter-overlook, to counter-look, whatever we might call it. And we will then, as Lubna mentioned, also have time for reflections as well as for a Q&A. So whenever any one of the audience or also perhaps the fellow panelists have questions, just please put them in the Q&A box and we will have an eye on that. But yeah, before we go into the content of the different articles of the special issue, I want to invite Isolde for some introductory words to explain how it was conceived, how we're framing that idea of overlookedness in the Overlooked Cities Collective. Over to you, Isolde.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I think I need to start by just a warm thank you to Lubna and her team for this special issue, for I think primarily your patience and endurance with all of us, but also the fact that you allowed and encouraged and facilitated an overlooked scholarship through this special issue. So when I talk about this work, I like to start with how I got into this. And it was at the beginning of 2019. And I was at a workshop that we were supposed to write proposals for seed funding. And as I was talking to someone about my work, I told them, so I'm interested in administrative cities of South Africa. So, I really work on boring cities. And she got so excited. She said, oh, you have to speak to Hannah Ruschik. She also works on boring cities. And that is how it started for me, with this idea of boring cities. Of course, Julia was also part of that book project with Hannah Ruschik, with Erwin Nugra, and with with our other colleague, Yimin. And together we worked on the very first book project. On overlooked cities. The full title of the book was Overlooked Cities: Power, Politics, and Knowledge Beyond the Urban South. And then from there, the four of us wrote a proposal for an Urban Studies Foundation grant for a seminar series. And I think this special issue is really thanks to the generous funding of the Urban Studies Foundation. Because from there, from working on this boring cities, and I remember very clearly telling Irene that for me, getting the Urban Studies Foundation grant started with not getting a grant, because Hannah and I failed. We asked for funding for me to be part of that book project and to go to the UK to be part of the workshop. In the end, we didn't get the funding, but we believed in the project, and I thought I would still like to be part of it, even though there's not funding, and we made it work remotely. And then, thanks to this funding from the Urban Studies Foundation, we then hosted 3 seminars in 3 overlooked cities. And we were very intentional about hosting these seminars in overlooked cities, because we thought that we would think differently, we would attract different scholars, we would get different contributions, and indeed we did. So our very first seminar was in Bandung. That was in September 2023. The next one, and Irene, Chester, and Rita attended the seminar in Bandung. Then the next one was in October 2023, and Stefan and Latifa and I were at that seminar. And it was through then the third seminar took place the next year in June in Durham, and Julia was there, and the other members of the Overlooked Cities collective, and it is through this seminar series that the ideas grew from overlooked cities to overlooked people, places, and practices and from just so initially the book project and those who came together on boring cities, or whatever you might call it, we came together primarily around the ideas of secondary cities of Hardaway and Satterthwaite, or ordinary cities of Robinson, or the Rutledge Handbook on Cities from the Global South by Oldfield and Parnell, or even Peterson and Simone's Rogue Urbanisms. So the idea of overlooked cities is what started this. But through the seminar series and the funding from the Urban Studies Foundation, it grew into overlooked urbanities, overlookedness, and then this practice of overlooking. So we focused a lot more on also because the seminar series was very much focused also on early career researchers. And the Indonesia seminar the one in Bandung specifically included a workshop and around this around early career researchers. And it is through this that we also realize the need for counter-overlooking in academia and an overlooked methodology. And I think some of the speakers will later say about this. So I think you have the basic idea of where this started, where the special issue was born, where it started. I think it was maybe actually born at an RGS in 2018. And I only came to this in 2019, but that was where it was born, and it was really around idea of overlooked cities. But it grew to the idea of what is overlooked, why not only cities as such, but also lives, also inhabitants, also realities within cities, and then why. So to take a hard look and to render visible our practices also in academia, and we therefore are very grateful to the journal, to Urbanisation, for accommodating this. And those are then my introductory remarks. Thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Isolde, for really narrating kind of like where we came from, where we're currently standing in our thinking and doing, and also just framing this as a collective project, which is always has been going, seeing different locations, talking to very different people, and really having this as a very nourishing, I think, generative process of thinking and doing urban studies, perhaps a bit different. So to dive straight into the articles, I want to ask first Chester and then Latifa to speak from their perspectives as researchers about the question of like, how do you actually do this kind of like shifting your gazes? Like, what does it imply for your research to do research with the sensitivity to the absences, to the omissions, to issues of neglect? We have first the case of evicted slum dwellers in Metro Manila, Chester, that you have been writing about. And then we're going to travel to South Africa, to an old railway town, to Taos River. So yeah, perhaps Chester first, the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. But first, let me also thank the Urbanization Journal and Lubna, and then the Overlooking Collective, right? Solde and Julia, without which I would not have probably not been able to publish this article, right? So what does it mean to shift the gaze? But I'm not so sure that I did in my work, because I've always sort of looked at communities and the most vulnerable and the most silent. I grew up in an environment that I was sort of sensitized to these realities, right? So when I began doing my work, I always looked at the most vulnerable. Right. So in this particular work, I did engage ethnography for almost a decade. But I think what's interesting is that I trace the families of those who were evicted 5 years later. So after the forced eviction, which was very violent, that I witnessed, I became friends with many of the people who were evicted. So after 5 years, I would go and try to find out where they were. Right. And I remember one time I was just walking in a very large boulevard, because some of my friends said, oh, we saw this guy and he's now living on the street. So I spent half a day just walking around the boulevard, but I could no longer find him. But I did find many of them in off-city resettlements that I knew they were transferred to. So I began talking to them and simply asking, how are you now? So how are you living, right? So I began looking at how their families were broken up, how women's care work and was exacerbated together with their community work, how males were deprived of the opportunity to actually do care work for their families, because they have to travel very far from their off-city resettlement and go to in cities and live in, uninhabitable spaces, live in pedicabs, in on the streets, in churches, to find work for their families or livelihood and income for their families, and how it also sort of becomes the foundation for what I refer to as counter-mobilities. These are sort of resistances of subaltern families in order to try to reunite family with livelihood and habitation. One that's violently broken apart by gentrification and capital. So I'm sort of in terms of methodology, it's very important to look at a longer timeline, one that's very much longer than a timeline that's often defined by capital and profitability timeline. So we look at a longer timeline because that's where we see how the sort of violence is imposed on the subaltern and how they find ways slowly, patiently to resist and sort of overcome overlookedness and much more neoliberal violence. Right. So that's my one.
Thank you, Chester. And I can also, I think, perhaps Lubna, you will also put in the chat, or you have already done so, the link to the different articles that are available, I think, for download for the month of July, open access, because it's really, I think, a very intense and very nuanced and multifaceted story of those lives that you've been tracing, and that also, I think, shows your gaze. And the point that you made at the beginning, that it was not so much about shifting the gaze, but it was very much, or it is very much, where you have come from, or what your research has always been, to look at those residents and to work with those residents. This is something that I think many of us, can learn from and reflect on. Thanks so much, Chester. I would like now to hand over to Latifa, who has been writing very beautifully about the stories, the narratives of Old House River of a railway town. And also, just to mention, because this is not something that happens every day, that Latifa has actually published a paper as a master's student. So huge congrats also to doing this. This has been like a huge achievement, and I think is a really, really important contribution to the special issue. So the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. And just to echo what Chester said, this really wouldn't have been possible without you, Julia and Isolde. Thank you so much for all the support for getting this published, and also for the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. It's quite a privilege to be amongst everybody else. As Julia just said, I'm a master's student, so still very much learning. So I'm part of the Urban Studies cohort at University of Cape Town, and for about 5 or 6 years, I drove by car between Johannesburg and Cape Town, which is about 1,400 kilometers. I did this trip about once or twice a year. And I noticed that there were many, many small towns in between this drive. And I always wondered, what was happening to these places. They were starkly different to Cape Town Metro and Johannesburg Metro. And when I got the opportunity to start my master's, I thought that I really just want to know about people's lived experiences in small towns. And I chose the town of Touwsrivier that was accessible for me to get to. And the assumption was that these places were forgotten, completely forgotten and overlooked. And I wasn't wrong there. There's a small school of thought based in Stellenbosch with Professor Lochner Marie and Professor Ronnie Donaldson. And with over 500 small towns in the whole of South Africa, it's assumed that, or it's been known now as a fact that most of these small towns have been forgotten. When I started, I didn't have any sort of big, in-depth, complex research questions about, policy in this town, infrastructure, tourism, cultural practices. I really just wanted to know about everyday lived experiences, narrative inquiries, storytelling, just sort of one-on-one with the residents of Toes River. And I was hoping that because while there has been a renewed interest in small towns in South Africa, there's very little, I would say very little to no one-on-one granular sort of micro level data when it comes to just one-on-one conversations with the small town residents. And so I just wanted to do this to add this human experience layer onto the literature that we currently have. And just going off with what Assistant Professor Stephanie Canizales, she's an assistant professor at UC Berkeley. She documented 200 stories on children migrants in the US. And she says really it was to make readers care despite the many other issues that we face. And exactly the same, this was just to make readers care despite many other issues that we face in our larger city and towns. And then again, just to echo what Isolde said earlier on, what started as overlookedness in cities, just became just overlookedness in general, and the ignored or forgotten societies in South Africa. And so, talking to friends and talking to colleagues and being very much still, new in this academic field, I did think so. So, so what is this? And this type of basic research is, while it doesn't have, and this is taken off Professor Lauren Newman's Handbook on Social Research Methods, this type of basic research doesn't have any short-term practical applications, but it's rather intended to build on our current understandings and knowledge that we have in various social issues. So, that is sort of where my work centered around. I hope that's okay. If there's anything else, Julia, that you'd like me to add, please let me know.
Latifa, I think we'll come back to what you said and what you said currently about just now about like making readers care, despite so many other issues that are going on, is something that probably resonates also with a lot of the other writers and thinkers that we have in the panel today, which is also, I think, a really nice segue to our third speaker, to Stefan, who's writing from also more like longitudinal perspective, practice-based perspective on issues of housing and homelessness in urban South Africa. And he's writing also about like this dual acknowledgement of urban overlookedness on the one hand and being looked at the other, which is kind of a dynamic relationship that also is something that is traveling throughout the special issue. And in your article, you cite at the very beginning Arundhati Roy, who writes in her book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, that there's really no such thing as the voiceless. They're only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And you then argue for praxis to counter-overlookedness, a praxis that is grounded in a love that is watchful. So I'm really curious also to hear from you, Stefan. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, and thank you for, you were very patient with me. I took a long time to to submit. I think partly it is the tension, similar to Chester. I spent 2 decades working in communities and with street-based populations before I came to the university. So my immersions were different, and I think I still find 12 years into the university, this tension about knowledge production and what is knowledge production and what is academic and what is real academic stuff. And so this, in my title, I had this idea of being looked at. And it kind of connects with the idea that I think if we want to develop a counter praxis to overcome the overlookedness, there's a need probably to use terms like humility and vulnerability. I think sometimes we want to control situations, even as researchers and academics. But how do we allow ourselves to become vulnerable in spaces so that the experiences, the knowledges the wisdoms of those spaces can speak to us and can actually look at us so that we are looked at, so that we can be caught out for our own blind spots, our own negligences, our own complicity sometimes, deliberate or not so deliberate. And so I think that's, I kind of focused a little bit on that idea of being looked at. And then the idea, and it links to what Latifa spoke about, I think it's Adler and Hansen that spoke of a scholarship of care. So I'm curious, are we overlooking certain cities, certain places, certain populations accidentally? Is it ignorance, or is it chosen ignorance because ignorance is bliss? Is it deliberate? Is it negligent? Is it simply that we're indifferent? So how do we, my interest was and is in how we develop a scholarship of care, to use Adler and Hansen, which sounds soft, but a scholarship of care is actually a specific political praxis where we choose to be in a different way, in a new way, in spaces that seem to be overlooked, to allow those spaces and the wisdoms and the experiences and the knowledges of those places to kind of speak to us, to disrupt us. If I think of our own university, we often still, when we think of things like community engagement, we will engage communities often on our terms. The center of knowledge production is still us. It's still in our institutions. And that shift, allowing for the center to shift, for those spaces that are made marginal, made invisible, to be at the center of knowledge production, and not for us to produce the knowledge, but for co-construction of knowledge, and for allowing those knowledges and experiences, and to document that, and to celebrate that. And I think that's very important if we want to think of, especially of cities in the global south, and where do we look for clues and for solutions for some of the very deep challenges we face. And so I think for me, and it connects back to what Chester was saying in the beginning, I think it's not just how one's own gaze is shifting, but the gaze of the institution. And we're all in institutions, and sometimes that's sometimes that's a tricky place to be in. It's a liminal space. We're between these different publics, and how do we also work and help our institutions to shift its gaze, not just in a cosmetic way, but in a way that can be truly disruptive. So that scholarship of care can be a political praxis that will be transformative also for our institutions and for the way in which we do urban scholarship. And that challenges, of course, everything, and our epistemologies, our methodologies, how we go about it, our very understanding of what the knowledge project is about. So, Julia, those were some of the accents I placed. And I deliberately then also, it wasn't just the overlooked city, but I looked at overlooked places, populations, solutions. There are certain sectors that in our city produce change and create infrastructure, but are always dismissed. They're never at the table when planning or policy is happening. And so how do we, and so there are different shifts that should take place. And I think in the title of the collection, that shift already also took place, I think, in the process, as Isolde described, from overlooked cities to the different layers of overlookedness that we find in how we engage with cities and urban places and populations.
Great. Thank you so much. I think the multiplicity of shifts, the layers of different shifts, and what you also brought to the fore, that it's not only researchers and practitioners shifting their gaze, but it's also very much about our institutional work, and how we're contributing to something that is more structural in the way, institutions work with and desert themselves from, being sole, space that holds knowledge production. I think this is a very, very important contribution, and something that many of us are also thinking about and reflecting about. I nevertheless want to go back to this kind of us as collective, as panelists, shifting their gazes, and go to Irene, who has been reflecting on this again, like from perhaps two different lenses. So one, herself as an artist, contributing a visual essay to this special issue in terms of how there is a shifting of the gaze happening. But then she's also very much embracing the perspectives of children in San Jose del Monte in the Philippines. And she's also been challenging us to think not only negatively, I think, about overlookedness, but also seeing that there's a bit like another side of those points of, selective attention, patchy overlooking, you named it, and fragmented yet meaningful understandings of the world in the case of your main protagonist. So, Irene, how do children shift the gaze? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. So I think the question for me, is about our methods. I'd like to swerve the conversation a bit to the reasons why I chose a visual essay, given that I'm not really an artist. So that's a disclaimer. I'm not really an artist, but I tried to shift the gaze. I chose not to be a conventional academic as I am for this special issue. And I have two reasons for choosing a visual essay format. First, it is in response to the special issue theme that insinuates the sense of sight, the word overlooked, and the phrase shifting the gaze. I know it's more metaphorical than literal, but the theme's emphasis on sight and gaze inspired me to experiment with a visual approach. As an academic accustomed to conventional writing or text-based writing, I saw this opportunity to shift my own gaze and challenge my usual authorial voice beyond just presenting the perspective of a 12-year-old child from a secondary city in the Philippines called San Jose del Monte. And the second reason is that because my work is with children, I borrowed the idea of what picture books do to young children, which is, picture books, not illustrated books, are not very straightforward. The authors usually leave space for young readers to make sense of pictures and text together. That's why the text is limited in picture books. As you can see here, for example, like the text is very limited because you have to connect the text with the photos. And so likewise in my essay, I could have explained more, but I am after creating that sort of immersive experience for readers, like inviting them to actively engage with the context and patch together the narrative that was written in the article. And so the use of the collages or patches of photos in my essay reflects the fragmented nature of perception, where seeing is always partial and shifting. And I started the essay by presenting how a 12-year-old boy, Jose, told patches of different mini stories about his neighborhood, and the idea is to encourage, multiple readings and interpretations, because stories are always larger than they initially appear, and that meaning can always shift and deepen over time. And after all, this is not my story to tell. I'm just re-narrating. I'm just re-showing what I saw. And by presenting different visual elements, I encourage the readers to stitch together the visuals and text, and much like children do in reading picture books, and where the reader's role is active and participatory. So rather than providing a comprehensive explanation, I aim to offer a glimpse of the power of visual storytelling and the agency of the reader in making meaning. And so this is also about recognizing different ways of looking. And to give a bit of vulnerability myself, I was really afraid of doing this, because this approach was kind of a deliberate risk. Number one, because it intentionally leaves space for interpretation, mirroring the way picture books operate, which is not very academic. Because in the academic setting, we want everything signposted and explained. So it was difficult. And number two, it deviated from my usual writing style. And again, I'm not an artist. And Julie and Isolde know this, that I have tried different visual styles. And so it was really a challenge. However, the special issues theme of shifting perspectives and challenging dominant cases resonated with my desire to push the boundaries of academic communication as well. So different layers of shifting gazes, shifting writing styles, different ways of expression. And by embracing the visual essay format, I hope to contribute to the theme's objectives while also expanding my own creative and scholarly horizon. So here I invite readers to look again and discover new elements, much like revisiting a book or article. It can reveal new insights at every look, at every gaze.
Thank you, Irene, and also to I think everyone who has spoken so far, or the panelists. You're really good at I think teasering your contributions to the special issue. So again, invite everyone to also have a look at the chat where the direct links are posted to the visual essays, writing from practice, and the general articles that are part of the special issue. So we now want to kind of go from that idea of shifting the gaze or the gazes, the perspectives, to our second group of speakers who will share, I think, perhaps more methodologically reflections on their approaches to counter-overlooking in their articles. And I want to start with handing back to Isolde, who has published a writing from practice that reflects on the role of law in perpetuating spatial inequalities, injustices. And you zoom in on a very particularly busy national roads in Bloemfontein that you also visited as part of the spatial justice tours. That again was part of the seminar series that we hosted, I think. And yeah, I'm really very curious to hear how your reflections from these very particular roads then take you to questioning things such as notions of property and ownership, and some much bigger questions. So Isolde, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Indeed, my field is law. I have a law undergraduate, law master's, law doctorate. So I'm actually supposed to work in law. But I think to echo something of Stefan referred to this liminal space. And I think I often find myself in a liminal space between disciplines, because it's difficult to. I'm really interested in what the gaze of the law is. How does the law see? But I approach it from a critical perspective, because I think, as Stefan has pointed out, to look is a political act. So what is the politics behind law's gaze? And what I see, so absolutely, this was part of our spatial justice tour. And I think part of reflecting on this is also reflecting on the place of the spatial justice tour. I've attended seminars and workshops presented by Stefan where we started with a spatial justice tour. In this instance, we ended with it. And that's always, sometimes it's right in the middle. And that's also an interesting question of where do you put this? Do you use it as a point of departure to frame everything? Do you use it as something to bring everything together? But nonetheless, on this tour, we, as we stood on the road, and Latifa will remember this very clearly. It's a very clear image that almost marked that whole spatial justice tour, even though it wasn't intended. As we were standing, and our tour guide was explaining to us about the informal settlement on the wetlands on the one side, and the township, more formal township on the other side of the road. Cars were speeding by at 100 kilometers an hour. But as we stood there, in the 10 minutes we stood there, children were crossing the road the whole time, groups of children on this very busy road, to such an extent that one of the members of our group assisted these children across the road, because you are so concerned for them as these cars are. And kind of as an aside, our tour guide explained that, oh, you know what, this is not a municipal road. It's a national road, and therefore they can't install any road slowing mechanisms. So immediately I thought of, this is the gaze of law. In my experience, the law has an abstract gaze. It looks at space in an abstract way. In other words, here is a road. It is classified in terms of law and legislation as a particular road, and therefore you can't. There can't be traffic slowing mechanisms. And that completely overlooks the lived realities on the ground. The fact that there are children crossing, there's an hourly, every 10 minutes there were children crossing. And I was, for that, that really inspired me to critically look and re-look again at the gaze of law. I must say, that when we discussed the possibility of a special issue with urbanization, we talked about the different contributions that one can make. And I don't know if maybe I heard just exactly what I wanted to hear, but I was almost sure that there was a category called notes from the field and writing notes. And am I getting lost? Are you losing me? And in a recent publication by a feminist legal scholar, Anne Genovese, she has recently published a book called Feminist Jurisography, Law, History, Writing, and she writes it in a series of notes. And to her, this is a feminist endeavor, because she says, instead of being able to write this this entire coherent work as a mother, as a caregiver, she often has time only to write a short note and to jot down ideas and inspiration. So she sees this form of writing as a specific feminist project. And for me, overlooking, a counter-overlooking, looking differently, because it is an act of care, as some of the other contributors have said up to now. For me, that has always been a feminist project as well. So I think that kind of brings together where I bring law in. I presented, I used the specific case study also then in a later conference that the late Ben Davies organized, and he's really interested in plurality of property relations. And because I think that instead of seeing space as abstract, as the law often does, it should be seen as relational. And he reconceptualizes the whole idea of property as a relational one. And for me, what I then focused on, because I'm interested in this feminist endeavor also, I was really interested to then, when I started reading up on this road, to see that there are women organizing themselves in the mornings and in the busy times of the afternoon as to assist the children across the road. So they, in other words, for me, I was interested in this idea that these women are acting as if they own that part of the road. They are stepping into the shoes of the owners of the road. And I was interested in that idea of an expression of property that is not an ordinary understanding how we would describe it within law. So I think that that brings together something about the methodology, writing in this liminal space between disciplines, note taking, but then also to acknowledge, I know for many of the contributors, and I think Urbanisation and Lubna and her team have been very accommodating, but even within this accommodating space, many of the contributors have had difficulty with reviewers not entirely convinced by a scholarship of care. And I think this is something that we've articulated, or something that looks differently, that takes a different gaze, right, and a different perspective. And that is something that we've spoken about in the Overlooked collective, and I think something that also needs articulation. Yeah. So that brings together the ideas. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isolde, for going from, I think, bringing us to the scholarship of care to kind of feminist lenses, the particular contributions that law might or might not have in terms of, localizing, contextualizing understandings of space, and going from the abstract to the very concrete, and seeing how things are happening in practice or not. And I think what you also articulated was a bit that idea of a scholarship of care doesn't necessarily, for us as a collective, mean that this is something, a comfortable, fluffy space to be in, a cushioning space to be in, but that it can and should be uncomfortable. It should be disruptive, and that we're trying to push boundaries, sometimes also without, I think, Latifa, you've framed it very nicely before, without having a very clear idea of, what is the question that we're actually asking of that particular scholarships. But nonetheless, and I'm turning to Rita, that doesn't mean that we should let go of a very specific and very critical research agenda on overlookedness and overlooked people, places, practices. And I think, Rita, your general article does nothing less than kind of providing a very critical perspective on, how to refine this kind of research agenda based on counter-overlooking, which is a complex challenge, to say the least, both conceptually and methodologically. I think you point out both. And what you do, which I really appreciated reading your article, is that you articulate many questions that are just focusing on the essence, including, like, if we practice counter-overlooking, where and how should we begin? This is very straightforward formulated question, but so crucially essential. Or how can a researcher contextualize their research questions and methods if the basis of their formulation is the current body of knowledge that, again, insufficiently represents overlooked cities? So, Rita, I'm really curious, again, to hear about the contribution. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Julia, and thank you, Isolde. And like all the speakers before me, I really want to thank Isolde, Julia, and the whole Overlooked Cities Collective. This is a really, I would say, really dynamic group, and it's really like participating in this collection has been really giving me the opportunity to say something that I've wanted to say for a long time. And I actually wanted to start with, also in connection with what Chester has mentioned, most of us actually in this collective tend to look at people and spaces in the margins, people and spaces that are usually sort of like forgotten and in the collective's words, overlooked. And also in connection to what Stefan was saying, what do we mean by academic work? How do we define academic research? When people say, are you an academic? What does that mean? What do we actually do? And I would like to start actually by referencing something that I heard from someone whom I've learned from a lot, and he was actually part of the community whom I've been following over I don't know how many years already. So he was an urban poor activist. And I just want to mention this because this quote didn't actually make it to the paper. And I intended to start the paper with this quote. And then I had to cut it out because of the word count. And also because of some suggestions from reviewers. But I still feel that this quote actually is one that is very inspirational. And I'm just going to say it verbatim here. So he said to me, and this was as recent as last year, how many PhDs have academia churned out from studying our community? For many years, many researchers have come and gone. They got their doctorates and academic careers while we remain poor. So this was a quote that I think it was really powerful. That this was actually said by an urban poor activist, and he continued to be categorized as urban poor. But he was right. How many researchers actually have gotten their PhDs, and all these researchers economically, belong to a certain demographics that are not poor. And then a lot of the publications actually come out. We rise in our academic ranks because of the publications. And if we say that, we study people in the margins, but what would that bring? So why do we actually study cities? To what extent do our research publications play a role in the shaping of cities? And we are always asked to address some concepts, right? And that is sort of like what defines knowledge building. But like you said, Julia, who actually define those concepts? Like, do we actually hear enough from the people whom we are studying, and to what extent we actually consider them as actual subjects rather than just objects of study. So I think, like I've been wanting to also articulate this, and I wish I could have come up with a better title for my paper. After it was published, I felt that the title was so clunky. But anyway, like you said, I would like to, for it to be a contribution. So if we are really seriously countering all these overlooking, right? That that many have been doing. What should we actually do? Sorry, I think there's this. Yeah, I better turn off. Yeah. So one of the things that I just want to highlight here, just one approach that I would like to encourage all of us to do, and I'm sure that many of us have done it, but we need to continue to remind ourselves to do this, is that because we all study cities, and there are certain cities that kept being studied, and even in certain cities there are certain spaces that become centers of attention, and there are ways in which cities are ranked, cities are seen as something that is better than others. We need to continue to have this attitude of skepticism, and that's what I mentioned in my paper, is that when we look at a space, no matter how pretty it might seem, there are stories that might be overlooked. And this was actually inspired by some conversations that we had in Bandung in one of the workshops, that we actually visited this place in which everybody said, "Wow, it's so wonderful! Look at all these children play in this park." It was actually a park underneath a flyover. Usually, a flyover underneath a flyover is this wasted space that are not articulated. But this particular underneath a flyover, there's this park in which all the children seems to be happy playing, and then there's this big megatron that seems to be, it's a public space where everybody can seem to, watch a film or something like that. So it's presented as something that is beautiful. And of course, many of us who were there, we felt that, yeah, this is a very active space, very lively, and all that. And so we all have this sort of like feel good feeling when we are there. But of course, in every space, there are so many layers that are not directly visible. And for those who are not really, and a space is not just that in that particular time. There are many layers before that particular time. And before it gets to that space, the enabler to get to have that beautiful space that we saw involves displacement. It involved also a lot of other things that might not be as pretty. Looking at that megatron, how much electricity is actually used to power that megatron, and how is that electricity produced? Looking at the landscape, how was that landscape created? How much money did it take from the city budget to create it? And how much does it actually take away from other kinds of resources that could have been dedicated for other things that are more immediate? So those are the things that for any places that we feel, okay, this seems like a good idea, I feel that there is this attitude of skepticism that we need to keep to sort of give that effort to counter overlook, because it seems that when we start to celebrate something, that means there's something most likely we are overlooking something, especially when we are studying cities in the global south, where in which a lot of power inequalities are at play in creating these spaces. I mean, of course, there are different levels, different intensities of inequalities, and that is what we need to inquire. But in any space that we feel that, okay, we want to, we feel good here, then the attitude of skepticism has to kick in. So I just want to highlight that part, and I'll just give it back to you, Julia. so we can we can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the attitude of skepticism will definitely go into our lexicon of things to consider when counter-overlooking, and how to really take that seriously. No, it's not just something that sounds nice and sounds like something you want to embrace, but what does it actually take, and how do you go about it methodologically to look for the elsewheres, to dig deeper, to see where the trade-offs are in particular contexts again. So now, finishing our second round of speakers, I want to go to Siddharth, who is the poem in the group of writers here. And your reaction to our proposed outline for this webinar and your talk was that you'd rather have a free-flowing conversation. And you wrote in your email, and I quote you here, about a conversation that touches upon the cadence of cities, the empathy in storytelling, trying to find one's place in the world, the texture of new nostalgia, etc. And reading this in your two poems, I want to start this conversation perhaps with asking you what attracts you to bring poetry to perhaps very unusual or rather unusual spaces like emails and academic journals, and perhaps also to audiences that come with that. So us academics, what is your relation there, or where do you see the value?
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Isolde. It's been lovely sort of hearing everyone's thoughts this evening. It's evening in India. My practice as a writer often, consists of seeing this world through the eyes of others, or immersing myself in places and streets and neighborhoods that perhaps might not be part of the normal narrative and part of the everyday discourse. The poems in this in question, which are part of the publication, are based in Damascus and the Iranian city of Isfahan, which brings me to a sort of interesting observation about this whole conversation, is how the fact of overlooked cities or overlookedness is also a shifting continent, because it's a real tragic notion if we start to think of fabled cities as Damascus as overlooked, because these were cities of culture and the humanities and power and intrigue and all of that. But the fact that now so many of them are in the greater sort of conversation, overlooked, is a great sort of tragedy, and something that might need to be reclaimed and recovered when we talk about cities and when we talk about journeys and when we talk about our lives as storytellers. And I've always been interested in those spaces. I've always been interested in a Beirut or a Lucknow or a Hyderabad or cities with great sort of intrigue and charisma and sort of political and literary and artistic drama, for lack of a better word. And I've I mean, we've touched upon this. Even within larger cities, like say a Bombay or a Paris or an Istanbul, trying to find the stories that perhaps are not the everyday stories. That's where much of my interest lies, certainly.
Because then I would be interested, and that's perhaps also picking up on what Irene was saying earlier, in how you, when you start writing and seeing through the eyes of others, how you choose about what is being made explicit, what you suggest implicitly, because the story is always bigger than what it might appear, but then also what you choose to leave absent in your poetry, especially when you talk about things like loss and about cities that were and that are not anymore in that way.
Absolutely, and I feel we're kind of in a state of transience and ephemeral, sort of the ephemeral nature of things, where I think I especially find the need or the urge to hold on a bit stronger, where you know that things are there, but you also know that a city might be lost very quickly, or that a particular street might be lost, or that a particular neighborhood might be lost. And then then the role of the writer or the poet or whatever, the fictionist, becomes the role of the archivist, you know? You're documenting things, you're archiving things with your writing, and you're perhaps uh, immortalizing things for readers generations down the line. Uh, to tell them that there was a city called Damascus, there was a city called Isfahan, there was a city called Hyderabad, and you want to sort of uh, guide them through that. And this aspect of looking at life or looking at the world through the gaze of others is also an act of empathy, I feel, because then you have to put yourself in the lives of others and uh, try and understand life and the world and day-to-day existence through not just your own existence, but through the existence of someone who might be marginalized or might be overlooked in many ways.
Thank you so much, Siddharth, and also I think like every one of the speakers. So we have, I think, just one question in the Q&A box. So as was also now written in the chat, please, to everyone in the audience, to all the attendees, feel free to post the questions there, and we can go through them. But in the meanwhile, I would like to ask the panelists perhaps to start thinking about what next for their research, which is partly our closing round, but also perhaps an opportunity to, as Rita was saying, to think collectively and not only individually about recharting forward that research agenda on overlookedness. So I would invite you to use this final round as on the one hand as a reflection on your side, but also feel free to pose questions to other panelists, or if there are more questions appearing in the Q&A that you would like to pick up, just to pick and choose there. And I propose that we would go in the same order of speakers that we had before. So Chester, if you would like to give it a start, that would be great.
All right. So the question is looking at how do we define overlookedness and how do we sort of go about it. No, I think it's a process of constant interrogation, right? While we are sort of cognizant of the dominant exclusions in urbanization, particularly in the global south, one that's pushed by often real estate capital and gentrification and subaltern exclusions and depletions. We are also looking at uh, an open space where other forms of overlookedness can be marked. Like so, in my own work, I sort of look at a longer timeline so that I can mark the everyday negotiations and the everyday resistances of the very poor as they negotiate the sort of disjunct and the contradictions of gentrification brought about by real estate. When we do that, we open up the spaces to sort of the sufferings and recognize that a lot of the urban development in the global south is underpinned really by the sufferings of the really poor and their families. How these sort of grand buildings and grand developments in central cities is born at the backs of families and their children, and how they sort of resist that every day. But we need to have a longer timeline, a much more patient space, a sort of a politics of care over a longer time period, one that can only be entertained in a space that's constantly engaged and constantly interrogated while cognizant of the dominant exclusion. But others?
Aditya, would you like to pick up on where you see either your research going next, but also there have been a few more questions in the Q&A now, in case you want to address one of those.
Through this time, I was just thinking, why are certain places overlooked? And I think that, in an ideal world, nobody and no areas would be overlooked, just based on the fact that all people matter. And so why are these places being overlooked, I think, is also, and by whom are they being overlooked? I think in my case specifically, when there was no need, so Toesrivier is an old railway town, and it was benefiting the cause and benefiting the rich. And when that mode of transport was no longer needed, the economy pulled out and those people were just left. And also just going back to what Stefan said about, whether the ignorance is deliberate or unknown, I think, especially in the context here of South Africa, I do think that many of these overlooked spaces on the peripheries are deliberately overlooked because they don't benefit the cause and the metros anymore. So that is also something that it's just what I was thinking about. Going further into research and what I'd like to do further, just to touch on what Rita was saying as well, it's something that I thought about as well. What do we do with regards to that sort of extractive research? You go into an area, you do your research, you get your master's, your PhD, and then you leave again. And when I voiced this concern about, what do I do after I've done this work and I've gotten my my master's, like what do I do? Do I just leave those people never to be seen or heard of again, and a lot of people told me it's unrealistic to keep a relationship with these people because I'll be doing many other things. I have actually still kept a relationship with them. And then it also goes into, again, what Stefan said about the scholarship of care, and also, again, what Rita said, just about that co-production of getting the people in the place of study to actually contribute to your work. So just shifting this idea of what does academic research looks like? What does it look like? How can we change it? In including people who are not formally academically educated or trained the way we are, maybe, just to sort of get them to be part of our research as well, and like to be co-producers of the work that we're doing. So yeah, just those are the sort of thoughts that I've had.
Thank you, Letifa. And perhaps coming back to your first point of this ideal world where no people places would be overlooked, there has just been a question also in the chat of if does overlookedness sometimes help keep the individuality of a place safe? Are there any hidden positives of being overlooked when it comes to the uniqueness of cities? And that's a question I think that we've been also meandering a lot about. So either in case you want to follow up on that, but I know that also I think Rita, you've brought that point up in the Bandung conference. Would you like to perhaps respond to that?
Okay. Well, I think there are several things that that came to my mind actually. I think when we say overlooked, right, and to overlook, the question of who is overlooking and who is being overlooked, it actually entails power relations, yeah, and those who are more powerful will likely be the one doing the overlooking. And I think if we say that a place is being overlooked, most likely is a consequence of power inequality in the making of urban spaces and the constellations of urban life, and therefore the ones who are being overlooked. That includes being subordinated against their will, or some kind of limitation towards their own agency in actually making their spaces and to be heard. And so I think maybe this is actually a very interesting discussion, whether if a population or if a space is being overlooked, can it actually be by choice? I would actually I don't know. I don't really know about that, because I feel that when we are being subordinated in terms of power relations, I think it's unlikely by choice that we want to be subordinated. But if we want to remain in secret, if we want to be, under the radar, if we want to keep some information for ourselves, to protect our communities, it actually entails a certain kind of power from within us who choose to not be seen, and in that way, the situation of not being seen is not necessarily being overlooked, but it's sort of like choosing to not be on the map. For example, there are some movements that you want to be off the map because if you map everything, that means that you are revealing too much and you're giving this a lot of data to people who may actually use it against you, right? So I think there are certain difference there. I think it is a very interesting thing to discuss. I do feel that there is a certain kind of difference there. I'm not sure whether I can articulate that in this very short moment of discussion. But yeah, I just want to also touch base a little bit on the point about from the third question. What are the ways in which researchers can take their research back to their subjects or benefit them in some way? Yeah, I also say that this is not an easy thing to do because we also need to acknowledge that even between researchers and the communities that we study, there might well be inequalities as well. And to be able to continue to be aware of that, it actually becomes an obligation, right? For us to continue to engage, to continue to care. And I think in my own experience conducting research, I feel that the kind of decisions on what we want to do research on is really something that we need to care about. I mean, I don't believe that we need to be sort of like, I don't believe that we can be neutral. That's one thing, because in the context in which the power relations are very much unequal, if we claim to be neutral, we know that it means that it's more likely to benefit the status quo, right? So I don't think that being a researcher and our decision to conduct research with the places that we choose to engage to, that means that we are making the choice to actually care about the space, and therefore the way we try to craft and articulate the research questions and the follow-ups should actually reflect the kinds of relationship that we wish to build. I should admit that if people say you can't go into space, what is your exit strategy? I don't have an exit strategy, and I don't think I ever left my research field unless the community choose to leave me. I try to as much as I can, and of course there are certain limitations to that as well. We are all humans after all. But as much as I can, I don't want to leave my research field. It might actually go against me in some ways, because we also have limited capacity. But I'm very sure that if we do it as a collective, because we are not alone, and that's why we also need to move away from this sort of like individual metrics of achieving, research results. You're being measured as your H index and whatever it is. It's always individual. But if we work as a collective, because the kinds of questions that we address is never really something that we can address individually. If we want to really do something, if we want our research to be meaningful to the community, I believe it's never an individual contribution. It's always likely to be collective, either collective with communities, collective with other researchers and communities. The co-creation is something that needs to be taken seriously, not just between researcher and community, but also a collective of researchers with communities that we work with. I think that's sort of like my reflection from experience. I would love to hear from others too.
Exactly. Thank you, Rita, for articulating that so clearly. just looking at the time and limited resources that you just mentioned, I would like to ask those who haven't spoken yet to perhaps try and keep it a bit shorter. And I saw that, Stefan, you've already unmuted, so please go ahead.
Could I, Julia? Yeah, so I think it's an ongoing question for me, is what does solidarity look like? So it's care, but it's also solidarity that doesn't necessarily have a beginning and an end. Although in a research project with funding might have a beginning and an end, and that's part of the challenge. But my understanding would be that this and both Chester and Rita mentioned it. What is the time frame? And I think that's sometimes the problem is we could link ourselves to time frames because it's linked to funding, and it is not necessarily asking the question of what does solidarity look like with communities, so that the knowledge that are collectively produced might actually have deeper liberative kinds of impact. And with that, I think is the question that we have to continue to break our heads around, is this question of dissemination or giving feedback or whatever. What does that look like? Of course, I don't know in other contexts, but in South Africa, only certain academic products are rewarded. But I think, we need to look at new media. We need to look at all kinds of other ways in which could also become resources then for communities in which we do the research, if we can package the outputs and the discoveries we make collectively in new formats and in different formats that's not looking like the conventional academic outputs. Just in one place, I mean, and I'll just say that and then I'll be quiet. But there's a community in which during COVID we were just so struck by the the university campus closed down, the religious communities closed down, the municipality closed down. But these community organizations couldn't close down. It was a matter of life and death. And started to realize that the infrastructure that they create on a day-to-day basis is extremely vital in that space, but it's not documented. It's not even validated. And so one of the ways there, and somebody mentioned the term archiving, but one of the ways there is that there's a story mapping process where the stories of those 100 plus community-based organizations are captured, are shared, and it also becomes a resource in the community itself. So I think we need to find novel ways, and not allow the institution to tell us it's not possible.
Some of those novel ways might come from artists who are very much artist academics. Irene.
Yeah, I have just like 3 quick points. The first one is picking up from the previous panelist, and let me look back to the Durham culminating seminar and related to Rita's point. Gia, if you remember, Yimin's student said that being at the center doesn't automatically confer significance or guarantee change, especially when studying overlooked groups like refugees, for example. There's a lot of layers there. In fact, centering ourselves or like them can sometimes perpetuate the existing power dynamics and then silencing or distorting the voices and experiences of those we're trying to expand it. But another thing is, aside from overlooked and not overlooked, there's a question of magnitude. Like overlookedness exists on the gradient with varying degrees of neglect, marginalization, and erasure. And this magnitude, this gradient, acknowledges that being overlooked is not a binary state, but rather like a really complex spectrum that and it can affect individuals and groups in different ways and to different extent. And so we need to be careful in defining or even do we have to? And finally, related to Stefan's point, finally, like moving forward, how ready are we to be called out for our blind spots and our complicity and all that we claim overlooked? That's it.
Good question. And thank you also for bringing back those reflections from Durham. And again, like saying perhaps that the special issues perhaps are a few contributions that have been made throughout this Urban Studies Foundation seminar series. And there are perhaps a few more that we want to write up and include into spaces of conversations like this one. Siddharth, I'm going to hand over to you.
I just have a very quick comment on your overall question. what gets overlooked and what doesn't. There's also, in our times of huge media oversaturation, it's also very plainly and very explicitly the media decides. Uh, that this thing is worth reporting and this thing is worth magnifying, and this thing doesn't deserve any coverage at all. Uh, so much of what we do consider as overlooked and not overlooked, and the very sort of act of overlookedness, I think, is an act of the media in this day and age. And very quickly, also, there was someone who asked a question about how perhaps being overlooked might be a good thing. And I suspect that only comes from a point of privilege. And you're seeing this in Europe right now, how they're sort of railing against tourism. And they don't want tourists to come there. And they're sort of pouring water over tourists and all of that. And this is happening in Spain and Italy. And in a manner, they do want to be overlooked and say, just leave us alone. And that's coming from a point of privilege as well. So it's a very sort of curious sort of thing that, to be overlooked and not to be. And but I think it falls on the academics and the writers and the poets and the artists to sort of push smaller communities and forgotten neighborhoods and lost cities into the forefront, or at least into people's minds.
That notion of privilege, that is, something that is very important also to keep in mind. Before I hand over to Isolde, let me just also start by thanking all the panelists for the contributions. And I think what for me came out very vividly, again, after obviously also reading what you've written, is on the one hand the how of the writing, that it has been very different processes, very different ways of expression, that it's precisely that diversity, that variety that is needed. Also that this is an ongoing conversation that should be collective, but that should also go outside of academia, or come from outside of academia, I think, as some of you have proposed. So I just want to hand over to Isolde to share her reflections before we wrap up the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you so much for all of the panelists. I sat here, and every time that members of the collective comes together, or when we discuss these ideas, I know exactly why I feel very strongly about this and about overlookedness. So thank you very much to all of you. Questions 1 and 2. Question 1. This is definitely an ongoing process, an ongoing conversation, a relational one, a collective one, as Julia said. And we have been, from the beginning, very careful in not making this another category. So there's no informal checklist that kind of a tick box on what constitutes an overlooked place, person, or practice. So please join the conversation. In answering that question, I want to invite whomever posed the question to become part of the ongoing conversation. Question 2 was, does government even listen to us? And here I want to use something that I learned from Stefan, working with him in Pretoria, and he always asked the question, who's at the table? Who do we invite to the table? And Stefan, thank you for that. That has stuck with me throughout. So I think so when we organize seminars, webinars, and I think that's also why we chose a journal like Urbanisation that targets a little bit of a different audience, that brings together different voices and also reaches different eyes and ears, brings different people to the table. And then I think so I'm in a bit of a different space now from academia, and if I thought academia was an echo chamber, then courts are definitely even more so. And I think, at least as academics, even if you're not in a full-time, even if your post does not have a full-time teaching component, but if you're involved in teaching from time to time, that is where we reach the government ultimately, because we never know what our students ultimately become. I remember driving with Chester to the airport, and what you said about your teaching, Chester, that has also stuck with me. And I think that these ideas that we share one another, we also, in being a collective, in saying that what you see is something important to see, the fact that others overlook it, is a political act, and is not that you are seeing something that is not there or not important, but we are also encouraging each other and strengthening each other's hands, arms, and voices, in also making that contribution and in transferring that to the students that we are responsible for. My last word goes to Julia. We are listed as two guest editors of this special edition, but I think I want to really acknowledge that Julia has played really the grounding role and the central role in this, and I can't thank you enough, Julia, for your competence, and for your just the manner in which you have handled this whole process. So thank you really to you. So then over to the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, all the panelists, for this engaging discussion and being present in full from the special issue. Thank you to all the attendees for participating and sending your questions. And I really hope that this conversation has piqued your interest and you'll go back and read all of our authors' articles. As I mentioned, the special issue on overlooked cities is free to access till the end of July. So please do go and have a look at them now. Thanks again, everyone, for joining and staying with us. Till next time.